What's going on? This is Ryan with Automatic Comics, and up next, we are going to be going over my 10 biggest losses from my comic selling business that I experienced the second half of this year. I did a video earlier this year with my 10 biggest losses from the first half. Now we're going to cover the second half of 2023. There's some interesting books in here. Let's check these out. All right, so before we get started, please remember to hit that like button and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this. So this is going to be my 10 biggest losses from the second half of this year. I did a video about halfway through the year where I went over my 10 biggest losses from the first half. That first half, it was about, I think, like $7,000 in losses for 10 books. It was a pretty big loss for that first half of the year, but I said it in that one. I do have more wins than losses. So these are things that I think are important to talk about just because they help you learn where your mistakes were, what you can take away from that kind of thing. So for these 10 books, this was a total of $4,100 in losses. So still a decent amount of losses for these 10 books. So there are some big ones in here. But again, I do have more wins and losses. I'm not trying to make this as some like sob video to get people's, sympathy for me or anything like that. I think that these are useful videos, something where we can see where those losses took place and how you can maybe prevent them in the future. If you're someone who is purchasing comics, even if you're not planning on selling them in the near term, just so that it can help you stay informed on your purchasing decisions. I also think that these are important just so that it shows people that not every sale is a win. Some comics don't always go up, and we can learn what books potentially are risky out there. And like I said, try to limit that risk in the future. So I've got these 10 books here. I'm going to start from the smallest loss of those 10 books and go to the largest one. I'll talk about what I purchased the book for, what I sold it for, what my loss was, both dollar wise and percentage, and what might have caused it. Some of them, maybe it's just comic boom. That's all it is. Other ones, there's probably some reasons behind it, some speculation, that kind of thing. All right, so let's check out number 10 here. And the prices I'm going to talk about with my purchasing prices, it's going to be with taxes, with shipping, all that kind of stuff. So it's my total in cost for that book. So the first one here was an X-Men 94. If you're not familiar with this book, this is the first appearance of the new team of the X-Men in the main title. So their first appearance is in Giant Size X-Men 1, but X-Men 94 is the first time you have that team in the title. This is where you've got Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Storm, Colossus, all those new characters that were brought on in Giant Size X-Men 1, except for Wolverine, which was in Hulk 180 and then 181. Now, this book, I lost $165.58, or approximately 28%. Now, I purchased this book in June of 2022, so still kind of in that comic boom period, for $585 plus about $15 in shipping. So a total of $600 approximately. I sold this book for $500 a little over a year later in August of 2023. Now you might say, well, if I sold it for $500 and I paid $600, why isn't it only just a loss of $100? Well, because you've got expenses that go into selling books as well. I had shipping costs of $10.60, and I also had eBay fees. This was an eBay sale of $68.10. So ultimately ended in my total loss of $165.58. Now, why did I take a loss on this book? I mean, this is one where I'd say entirely comic boom. This is, we had these huge spikes in prices in 2021 and 2022. We were having drops in prices in 2022. So you can see, like, this isn't nearly as big of a loss as it could have been. If we're looking at X-Men number 94, let's go down to a 5.5 and we can see where this book peaked. I mean, look at this. Like, a 5.5 had a peak price of $1,549. And that was in 2021, April of 2021. And you can see this, this chart here that we've got on Go Collect, where just massive spike in this book. I mean, this book was going for around $300, give or take, before the comic boom, and then spiked up to $1,500. This was one of the books that really, during the comic boom, jumped more than almost anything else, at least for a major key. There are definitely books out there that went up more. I mean, you've got like the Ultimate Fallout Forge or Jevic variant that went up like what, like 20 or 30x, but not a modern variant. I mean, this is a pretty major Bronze Age key, and this book went up like 400%. I mean, just huge jumps in value. And you can see it then continued this, it had this trend down pretty quickly, but still it's been trending down for about 2 years now. It has maybe started to level off a little bit here. It's currently going for around, looks like 475 to $500, and that's right around where I sold it. I mean, it seems like it's relatively flat. I don't know if it's a safe buy yet, but I'd say the risk is a lot lower at this point. So just something to consider if this is a book you've been looking for. It has retreated a lot. I'm not going to say it won't retreat a little bit more, but definitely a much safer buy than it used to be. I mean, considering I sold this book almost 4 months ago and it's still going around the same price with a lot of these sales. There are some lower ones. You've got some sales around 400 here, but the last few have been all around 475. So yeah. So if you've been looking for an X-Men 94, might be something to at least put on your watch list right now and just maybe look out for that deal. All right, now let's move on to number 9. Now, number 9 was another major title. This is Amazing Spider-Man number 6. This was a 2.5. I bought it in October of 2021 for $900. I sold it in July of 2023 for $800. This was a loss of $204.09, or almost 23%. Now, again, yeah, I sold it for $100 less than I bought it for, but I had a loss of around $200. That's because I had eBay fees of $107.49 and shipping fees of $10.60. So again, you always have to make sure that you're accounting for those sales fees. That is something that if you are someone who's buying and selling comics, you're generally going to have to account for that. And I know some people will say, well, why don't you sell off eBay? But when you sell off eBay, most people want you to back out the eBay fees anyway. So it's pretty much a wash. At least that's been my experience. So whether you sell it in one place or the other, as the seller, your take home generally ends up being about the same. But if you're a buyer out there, that's where, if you can find that person that's out on Instagram, like me, like I sell on Instagram and I cut people deals off my eBay prices, and you can generally find books for better prices that way. You can save a little bit of money. But this one, the reason I think that this one went down was a lot of it around that hype with the movie. So we had a lot of those characters that came back for that Spider-Man movie. It was an immensely popular movie, and a lot of those books really did spike with it. And Lizard was one of them. Now, if we take a look at a 2.5, kind of see what that book's doing right now, I would guess that this $1,000 fixed price sale was probably an offer. I wouldn't be surprised if the actual sales price was lower than that. If it's a fixed price sale and it's on eBay, which this one is, and somebody sends an offer through eBay, the Go Collect price won't recognize that. So it's just something to be aware of, that you can have little things that are off like that. But in general, it looks like it's been going for around $700. And now it hasn't sold for a few months, so it's hard to say exactly for sure in this grade. But again, if we look at the general trends for this book, I would say this one right around that the $700 price point for a 2.5 doesn't seem that far off from where I would expect it to be. So it has come down a little bit more in the last 5 months. Like I said, I sold it at 800. Looks like it's probably going around 700 now, but that's not too big of an adjustment anymore. If you watch Dave with Comic Book Investments, he's talked about this in some other videos as well, where we saw some really steep drops in prices in 2022 and maybe the first half of 2023. And those have been slowing down. At least it seems like that. And so it's not one of those things where necessarily, I'm not trying to tell people it's like, oh, go out and buy all these books, that kind of stuff. But it does, for a lot of books, seem like your downside risk is lower. And so that's one of the things I've talked about in a lot of videos. I kind of like to look at the general trends of the books, where they were prior to the comic boom in 2021. And if they're getting down around those prices, at least your downside risk is lower. All right, now number 8. I really like this book, but this one got really overheated and has retreated a lot. This is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles number 1, but it's the 4th print. So this is the first time that this print, that the issue number 1 is actually a standard comic size. The first through third prints are the larger size. They go into the magazine size slabs, and they all look generally the same. There's minor differences between the third print and the first and second, but the fourth one is very different. It's not just the red cover. You've got this actual full color cover. You can really see more easily that it's Shredder's arm that's on the cover there. It's a little harder to make that out in the first through the third prints. But this is a book that I bought for $750 in November of 2020. I bought this one even kind of like before the comic boom really started, but the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were one of the first books that started spiking, and they did start spiking back in 2020. They were kind of like the canary in the coal mine for the comic boom that was coming. And I sold this one in September of 2023 for $640. So I lost $205.90 or 28% on this book. This included $85.93 in eBay fees. I also used a promotion on this one that cost me an extra $13.87. I did go back to starting to use promotions some this year. I decided it was worth the additional cost on eBay to give it a try, and it seems like it's been pretty effective. It's hard to tell. It's really hard to tell if the book would have sold whether you had the promotion or not, but I have been starting to use them again on eBay. But this is one of those, like I said, it was just a book that I probably bought that near the peak. So if we take a look at the sales for this one, it is a book that looks like it's currently going for around $450, give or take. So it has corrected quite a bit. Prior to the comic boom, it was going for, looks like maybe around 300 to 350 in that range. So it might still go down a little bit more. But again, this is one that it feels like the downside risk is relatively low. I think it's a really cool book. I really like the cover. It is that first appearance of the Turtles, even though, it's the fourth printing, but it is that first appearance of the Turtles. But again, this is another one that feels like the downside risk is relatively low. All right, now number 7. This is Exo Man of War 1/2, the gold edition. This was a special book that was relatively difficult to get at the time. This is from Valiant. It's from 1993. Definitely one of those, kind of like gimmicks from the 90s to try to boost sales, that kind of thing. But this one, I had a 9.8 that I bought in August of 2020. This is over 3 years ago, August of 2020, for $432.48 plus $5.52 shipping. So about $438. I sold it in November of this year for $240. I took a loss of $232.62 or 53%. Percentage wise, this was the second worst loss that I took. This is a pretty big percentage wise loss. This is one of those that this is just a learning experience. If you're buying and selling comics, you also have to understand the demand side. And the demand for a book like this is just pretty small. The demand for Spider-Man, X-Men, Fantastic Four, those types of books, if you really want to sell those, you can. But with Exo Man of War, the demand just isn't there quite as much. My eBay fees on this one were $34.30. I also had a promotion on this that was $5.51. And I had shipping of $8.82. So that all added up to my loss of $232.62 on this book. I don't have much else to say about it. Just maybe don't buy Valiant. Something like that. All right, now number 6. Here we have got X-Men Annual number 14. I had this book in a 9.8. I bought it in May of 2021. So peak comic boom. That was really when all the spikes started. So May 2021 for $441. I sold it in September of 2023 for $225. So this one was actually my biggest percentage loss. This was a 57% loss, $252.60. I had $32.11 in eBay fees, $5.15 in a promotion, and $12.78 in shipping. I mean, this one, it was time to let it go. I did not think that this book was coming back anytime soon. Not familiar with this. This is that first appearance of Gambit. It's the one where he's on multiple pages. People don't like that it's called the cameo, and that X-Men 266 is the first full appearance when he's on multiple pages, all that. I'm not getting into that argument here. But one of the things I'll say is during the comic boom, there were a lot of people trying to push this book as that first appearance. And I think that played a role in the spikes in prices for this book. And then people realized that they want X-Men 266. They want that one more. Now, that book has corrected a ton as well. So don't get me wrong with that. That book has probably more than been cut in half. But if we take a look at this book in a 9.8, it's currently looks like it's going for around $150. So it has come back even more in the last 3 to 4 months. And prior to the comic boom, this book was, I mean, it was like a $200 book. So you could argue this book has even maybe overcorrected. It had this spike here in mid 2020. Like it had been about $100, $125 book before that, jumped to around a $200 book. And that was probably, I don't know if there's maybe some type of Gambit announcement, maybe with a movie or something that caused that. But this book has actually corrected back down below those prices. I mean, the last sale here, $158 in December. I mean, this book has definitely come down a lot. I feel like the risk is very low with this book. I mean, when you're down below 2020 prices on a book that is a legitimate key, I mean, it is the first time that you see Gambit in comics. It is a legitimate key. I don't like the cover. I know some people like this. I think it's an Art Adams cover. I don't like this cover. I think there's too much going on this one. And I'm a guy that likes Schomburg covers, and I still feel like there's too much going on this cover. But again, another book that just the downside risk feels relatively low. We're gonna get the X-Men. I know people aren't high on the MCU and the movies and that kind of stuff right now, but we're gonna get the X-Men. It will probably have some type of impact, especially when you have books that have corrected below 2020 prices. So again, another book, I feel like the risk relatively low in picking this one up. And I don't have this book for sale or anything like that. So it's not like I'm trying to, push this book. All right. Now the next one, number 5 on the list. Fantastic Four, number 3. I really like this book. This is the first time that you have the Fantastic Four in the costumes. You've got the Fantastic Car on the cover. You've got all of them on the cover. This is the one where you have the what is it? The two left hands. I think it's the two left hands of Human Torch on there. So if we, take a look, he's actually got two left hands there. I think it's left hands, but regardless, and this is the third issue. The Fantastic Four. I'm pretty sure it should be the third appearance. I don't think they appeared anywhere else in between. And I had a 2.0 that I bought in March of 2022 for $1,155. I sold it just at the end of December for $800. I took a loss of $375.32 on this one, or 33%. So this is a pretty big loss. This one was a PayPal sale, so I only had $24 in fees on this one. It's like 2.99% for the PayPal fees, and $10.24 in shipping. So yeah, this was a little bit bigger of a loss, $375. It's one of those that I do think when we get the Fantastic Four, we are going to have a return to some bigger prices for these earlier Fantastic Four books. I think we are in a state where some of these keys are starting to overcorrect, like we saw with that X-Men Annual 14. And so these types of books, if you have been on the sidelines for the last couple of years with these big spikes in prices, again, I'm not saying necessarily to go rush out and buy anything, but put it on your watch list. See if you can find that deal out there and try to pick up some of these books, because I do think it is getting much safer to buy these comics. Not saying they couldn't drop more, but your downside risk is lower. Because I know people are going to be like, oh, he sells comics. He's trying to, get people to buy. And that's not the case. That's not what I'm trying to do here. If you watch my channel, if you know my channel, that is not what I do. I will often tell people to not buy books that I even have for sale. So, so I'm just telling you that the downside risk feels lower with a lot of these, especially from these major titles like Amazing Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, X-Men, that kind of thing, where the negativity gets so high, like it's been out there right now, that I think books just overcorrect at that point. And that's the time when I think people they get so negative, they don't act on it, when that's actually the time you should be really looking. All right. Now, number 4, more Amazing Spider-Man. Amazing Spider-Man made up a lot of this list. So this is Amazing Spider-Man number 2. This was a raw copy that I sold. So this one I bought in June of 2022 for just under $1,600, and I sold it in August of 2023 for $1,250. I took a $527 loss on this one, 33%. I had eBay fees of $155.48, eBay promotion fees of $25.13. All of that added up to a pretty big loss on this book. And that always sucks when it's a major key like this, because yeah, a lot of times I think people think that major keys are always going to be safe. And I mean, as you've seen here, I've shown some pretty major books in here. I mean, X-Men 94, Amazing Spider-Man #6, Fantastic Four #3, and now Amazing Spider-Man #2. And took a pretty decent loss on this one. Again, this is one of those books that I think spiked because of the Spider-Man movie. Is just anything Spider-Man was really hot. The other thing that bit me a little bit on this one is that it was not graded correctly, in my opinion, when I bought it. And I didn't want to do the return. I didn't want, and I probably should have, but I didn't. And I think it was a lower grade than what it was sold to me as. But so that hurt some, but also just the retreat in prices for this book. Now, this is one that was a lower grade, but I'm just going to pick a sale that was more recent. And you can see, I mean, it seems like these have flattened out a little bit. I mean, they're definitely still high. So this is a book that maybe I'd be a little more nervous about. I mean, when you had this book prior to the comic boom in a 3.5 going for, looks like maybe around $1,200, $1,300. There's some sales down around 1,000, some up around 1,400, and it's sitting up around 2,000 right now. I'd be a little cautious. I don't know if maybe this one grade is an outlier. Let's check out maybe like a 6.0. And this one prior to the comic boom, about 3,000. Last sale in October, 3,700. That's a little closer. You can see that general trend up. It's getting pretty close to that. So that one doesn't seem all that bad, but that's why you really have to look at these grade by grade. Some grades have corrected more than others. And if I see something where it's well above those prices from prior to that comic boom, I'm just going to be cautious about it. And so like this one here, we've got a 5.0 prior to the boom in prices. This was about a $1,800 book. Last sale, 3,600. That would make me nervous. You know, I would be pretty cautious still with something like that. I mean, I know it's a major key. It's a third appearance of Spider-Man, but again, we've seen it doesn't really matter. Pretty much every key at least corrects back down to that trend line, if not back down to around the 2020 prices. And so I would be cautious. If this book looks like it's still trending down, I'd be cautious about it and just be patient. This is an example of one that I feel like is still probably a little overinflated. May depend on the grade, but I'd be cautious with this one. All right, now next, got more Spider-Man. Got an Amazing Spider-Man #14 this time. Here we've got the first appearance of the Green Goblin. And this one I picked up a 2.5 in December of 2021 for just over $1,800. I sold it in December of 2023 for $1,400. So this was a loss of 32%, $582. Had eBay fees of $174.93, shipping of $12.22. Yep. I mean, this is another one of those that definitely spiked because of that movie and has corrected a fair amount. So if we take a look at a 2.5, you will probably see my sale. Yep, this one here. And so this is what I'm talking about, where it says 1725, but it's actually 1400, and it's because it was an offer through their emailing system. So you can see this book more realistically was kind of going around the maybe 1300, 1250, 1400 price range. So just something to be aware of when you're looking at the pricing, that you do have to just be cautious of some of these things. You can go on to eBay and you can use their TerraPeak price tool, that if you want to confirm a price, you can get the actual sales price for that. Anybody that has an eBay account can do that. So just something to be aware of, that if you really want to double check some of those sales prices. But this is one that, I mean, prior to the comic boom, like a $700-800 book, maybe 900 on the upper end, and still sitting up around 12 or 1300. I mean, it's 3 years later. That's not too bad, but I'd still probably be a little patient with this one too. I mean, Amazing Spider-Man number 2, I'd be patient. Amazing Spider-Man 14, I'd be patient. I wouldn't be surprised if they correct a little bit more. All right. Now, the only real like spec book that's on here, and it's the number 2 loss. So, you pay the price for the spec if it doesn't doesn't pan out. It's Amazing Spider-Man number 210. First appearance of Madam Web. I bought a 9.8 back in April of 2022 for $1,400. Sold it in November of 2023 for $900. This one I took a loss of $627.57 or 45%. Had eBay fees of $123.62, shipping of $10.60. This is one of those that it got really hot when all the news came out about the Madam Web movie, and I think I sold it right around when that trailer came out. I mean, I still sold it at a pretty big loss, but those books definitely were selling some when that trailer came out. And yeah, I mean, is what it is. It's just like that this is the risk of spec books. If they don't pan out, then you're going to take a pretty big loss. I mean, you can see it had peak sales of around 18, $1,900. And so my buy is probably one of those in there where it dropped down, but then it just kept dropping. And so, yeah, that's the risk there. This is not a book that I would buy. I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to drop more. I mean, we can see we've got $700 sale. This is an offer, so not sure what it went for. 840. I mean, I would expect that this book is likely going to continue trending down. I didn't think that trailer looked very good. I don't expect that when the movie comes out, we're going to get any other spikes in prices or anything like that. Yeah, just an example of when you've got spec books and they don't work out, you got to sell them. And otherwise, you're just going to keep holding and you're going to take a bigger and bigger loss. All right, now the last one. Biggest loss on the list. Didn't quite take $1,000 loss on this one, but it was close. X-Men 101, first appearance of the Phoenix in a 9.6. I purchased this in November of 2021. So again, pretty close to that peak comic boom for $2,798 plus some shipping. So a little over $2,800. I sold it in September of 2023 for $1,900. I took a loss of $964.26, percentage loss of 34%. This one had PayPal fees of $57.26, shipping of $12.22. This book was actually one of my keeper books for a while before I went full golden age, before like everything was golden age. I had a lot of keeper books that were silver, bronze, even up into modern. Like I had a NYX3, was one of my keeper books, and a 9.8. But this one, I had been continuously upgrading copies. I think I started with a 9.2 or a 9.0, and then I went to a 9.4 and sold the prior one, went to a 9.6, sold the prior one. So overall, I probably more or less broke even with the X-Men 101 sales, even though I took a pretty big loss on this individual book. But this isn't really a spec book or anything. It's just a book that got really expensive, like everything else during the comic boom. And I bought it near the peak. I mean, November 14th, 2021, that's pretty close to peak prices for this book. And it retreated. Now, with this book, the one thing I wanted to talk about is that the 9.8 has actually held up surprisingly well. It did have one pretty low sale recently in December. You can see that here, this $4,800 sale on Heritage. But right before that, it had a $6,000 sale. Then in September, $5,600. I mean, this one it did peak at 10,000, but in general, this book has held up really well in a 9.8. It's one of those it's still corrected. I get it and all that, but it has bucked the trend of these huge drops relatively well. Now, what that means to me is that I would be pretty cautious with it. I mean, if you have this book that prior to the comic boom was going around, looks like 3,000, 3,500, somewhere in that range, I might be a little cautious with it. I might think that it's probably going to drop below 4,000 at some point. I wouldn't be shocked if this book drops below 4,000 and a 9.8 at some point. So this is one that if something has held up, to me, that's not necessarily a good sign. It just means that it has a decent chance to continue dropping. So I would prefer buying books that look like they have actually come back to their trend line relatively well. Books like this X-Men 94 that looks like it has returned to the trend line pretty well. That Amazing Spider-Man #6 that I talked about earlier, the X-Men Annual 14 that looks like it's actually retreated below those prices. Those are the types of books that I would be looking for. Books that are still elevated, I would be much more cautious about, like X-Men 101 in a 9.8. Other grades have retreated a little bit more. So maybe you don't have to be as cautious. You just check those individually. But 9.8s, I'd be pretty nervous about. So what are the big takeaways from all of this? If you are buying and selling comics as a business or as an investment, the goal is to have more wins than losses. Now, I talked about this in the other video that I did for the first half of the year. In the first half of the year, I had 38 losses out of 296 sales. So 87% of my sales were profitable. That's what you're aiming for. You want more wins than losses. In the second half of the year, I had 15 losses out of 208 sales. So 93% of my sales were profitable. Now, I did sell less books the second half of the year, but I actually had more total dollars in sales. So I just had some bigger sales, some bigger books that sold the second half of the year. But that's really my goal there. You want to have more wins than losses. In this case, about the average for the year was around 90% of my sales were profitable. And then you had some that were losses. And that's generally the goal. Now, my total losses for these 10 books I mentioned earlier was $4,100. My total losses from the second half for books that I had losses on was $4,455. But I had one sale I made $3,845. And that one sale almost wipes out all those losses. So yes, losses suck. It always sucks to sell a book for a loss, but sometimes it's better to just sell the book, get the money out of it, and then use it for something else. Just holding on if you're seeing things trending down, or you think it's going to take longer for them to recover, you don't see anything in the near term that's going to cause that book to recover, just take the loss, sell it, and move on. Because there is a time value to money. I've mentioned that in the prior video as well. If I have to wait 5 years to break even on something, I'd rather sell it, take that money, and use that to buy and sell a few comics. And maybe I get back to break even in a year or in 2 years. That's a lot better use of my money than waiting that 5 years. Now, the trends for these losses, I think, was pretty interesting, that it was a big difference between the first half of the year, for me at least, and the second half of the year. First half of the year, it was a lot of losses based on either spec books or the MCU. For example, books related to the Eternals or Shang-Chi, I took some pretty decent losses on. Whereas the second half of the year, it was major titles, not necessarily things that you would call spec books. And so this is Amazing Spider-Man, X-Men, and not small books either. I mean, we had Amazing Spider-Man 2, Amazing Spider-Man 14 and 6. I mean, first appearance of the Vulture, first Lizard, and first Green Goblin. I mean, major books. And then with X-Men, I mean, X-Men 94, another major book, X-Men 101. So definitely a difference in the types of books that I was taking losses on this time around. And part of that might be maybe people have decided that they've seen prices coming down for the last couple of years, and these bigger keys that had gotten prohibitively expensive, they're getting more back around where they were in that 2020 timeframe, and they're willing to go out there and pick up those books again. That could be the case. We'll see how this continues as we move on into 2024. But I think one of the important takeaways there is no matter how popular a title is, they can still get overheated. If you pay too much, you pay too much. But at least with popular titles like that, long term, you're probably going to do okay if you are okay holding on for 5 years or whatever it might be. For me, I like to actively buy and sell, so that's not necessarily the best solution for me with those books. I'd rather just sell them and go off and buy something else. There was one spec book in here. There was that Amazing Spider-Man 210. And so that's, you got to always remember with spec books, if they start to drop, you just have to let them go. It's better to just drop the price quickly, get the book sold, than to try to hold on and get a few more dollars out of it. Because if nobody buys the book, you're going to be another 6 months down the line, and maybe you're taking an even bigger loss. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. learn something from my losses, from my mistakes, that kind of thing. If you did, please hit that like button, subscribe button, notification bell, all that kind of stuff. I got more videos over here. If you'd like to watch some of my other videos, subscription button is right here. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, I'd really appreciate it. And I will see you in the next video.